Chapter 74. Ray and the lion paced side by side through the passage in the high hedge wall. The lion's head nodded with every step, as layers of its mane made their own rhythms. Ray was barefoot, and the soles of her feet tingled with the tight knit of the groomed lawn. Glancing over at the deep-chested cat, she considered asking for a ride on its back. The big cat glanced back at her with a guarded look that soon put an end to that fantasy, and the two of them entered the next part of the garden in silence. The well-trimmed lawns in these grounds were in full swing. A long line of bearded men paraded softly before them, stepping in tight circles as their line slowly progressed. Cloaked in long blue robes, their frocks swirled around them, splaying out in cotton balloons from beneath their crimson-red band at their waist. They all lifted their arms to the sky like marionettes, relaxed but poised. Heads cocked to one side, their tall felt hats set at an angle as they stepped and spun, stepped and spun, stepped and spun.
"The Mev-Levy,"
the lion said without further explanation, as they picked a route through the line of devotees. Each had their eyes closed, their attention inward, tuned in, and listening to something Ray could not hear. "So these are the dudes who make the sacrifices?" asked Ray.
No. Far from it. A most gentle people. I think they just like the garden. And they're not all dudes, either.
Another line whirled in front of them. Female Mev-Levy, dressed in rich green robes, their faces beardless and softer. They turned and danced in the opposite direction. As Ray and her companion passed through them, she noticed the curve of their long line. This was a ring, a wide circle with its own flow and beat. Step, step, spin. Their green cloth rising and rippling and turning, the women entranced, minds adrift, their bodies in perfect step. The next ring were men, travelling the other way, cloaked in butter-yellow vestments. Their circle that much smaller than the last. The dance was hypnotic, and Ray felt her steps grow heavy like the lion's. Drawn forwards, she saw over the tall camel hair hats of the Mev-Levy that they were approaching a most majestic tree, its gnarled, meandering branches forking upwards, holding the sky aloft. More mystical dancers, women in white, treading their path around the site. A few well-timed steps, and Ray cut through them too. And now she stood before the last ring of bearded men, reeling around, all in red. Over their shoulders and between the flick and twirl of their garments, Ray could see the tree and a gathering of people. But this last line of devotees turned in such a tight ring that Ray couldn't find a gap through which she might slip through and enter the final sanctuary. She did her best to peek over them. The trunk of the age-old tree was the broadest she'd seen. So thick it made the tree look squat, although it towered over everyone. Furrowed with a diamond-patterned bark, silvery grey tinged with orange and green moss, the trunk bulged and folded around itself. The first few branches that split off were themselves much wider than most tree trunks. A time-worn specimen from another era. In the shade of its expansive canopy, a stream of water bubbled up from a spring and drained into the rock pool around which the people were gathered. It wasn't your average crowd. The gathering seemed to be composed of statues, chiselled from pale stone, like the ones at the Perigon Conference Centre. Except these were alive, or at least they were moving around and talking amongst each other. Between the swirling heads and hats of the Mev Levy, Ray saw the man with the cloven thumb. He too was dressed in red, a deep crimson suit with a black shirt and lapels. He was fiddling with the matching bow tie around his neck, tugging and twisting it into a more pleasing shape. He was the last in a short queue leading to the rock pool. Before him, 2 young men stood waiting their turn. A statue of what presumably was a priestess beckoned the first man to the edge of the water, where a substantial boulder lay half submerged on the bank. At the priestess's direction, the youth knelt before the boulder and lay his head gently down upon its flat top. She said something to the crowd that Ray couldn't make out above the swishing material of the twirling dancers, then picked up a long golden blade from the ground. Straddling her imminent offering, the priestess made some gesticulations towards the tree trunk with her blade, then reached under his throat and sliced through it in one clean sweep. The priestess stood with solemnity and stepped away, allowing his blood to gush into the pool. A song rose amongst the congregation of statues as the man's life-blood flowed forth, an uplifting chorus full of celebration and hope. The blessings of the meeting of Adam and Eve, the blessings of the meeting of Joseph and Jacob, the blessings of gazing on paradise of all abodes, and yet another blessing that cannot be put into words, the fruitful scattering of joy of the children of the Shayak and our eldest. The song ended, and 2 statues stepped forward, lifted the man's body between them, and carried him from the pool. As they left the site, an opening appeared in the red Mev Devi's spinning ring, just enough space for them to bear their sacrifice away. Ray rushed towards it, hoping to skip quickly into the inner sanctum, but the configuration of turning acolytes closed their ranks before she had the chance. The next young man in line was summoned to the pool, and Mr. Thumb took a step forward. Ray turned to the lion with alarm. "Okay, which sacrifice are we on now?" she asked, although she already knew the answer.
"Number 8.
Of course. And so he would be, she said, pointing at the man with the cloven thumb.
The 9th. The king will be the 9th.
The next sacrifice had his head upon the boulder, and the priestess began her ritual. "Did you say king?" Ray asked, as she positioned herself where she expected the next opening to appear.
"I did."
But there was so much happening, it was hard for Ray to gather her thoughts. But why on earth would you kill the king? The priestess crouched over her victim and made the same motions with the blade.
"As the ultimate authority,"
the lion explained,
"the buck stops with him."
That single slice, the slump of the shoulders, the fountain of blood. Buck? What buck? But the congregation began singing before the lion could answer, and Ray didn't catch his reply. Perhaps he said something about a union. She couldn't be sure. Ray was desperate. She didn't understand. Things were going too fast, and she could feel events slipping away from her. It was all culminating, reaching a climax. But she didn't understand what was happening. She had to act, and she had to act now. The whirling dervishes changed their step to permit the departure of the 8th sacrifice. The gap opened, and this time Ray was ready to spring through it. Sculptured faces turned towards her in shock, and a gasp went up at her transgression. The man with the cloven thumb was walking towards the priestess. With the wave of her hand, he knelt before the boulder and lay his head down. Striding forth as fast as her dress would permit, Ray looked for a weapon. Anything she could use to defend him, to defend herself. The sculptured figure was carrying a couple of decorative metal bars. In one decisive movement, Ray snatched one. She wielded it above her head with both arms, its surprising weight perfect for her purpose, and leapt at the high priestess. The pale stone statue was already straddling the man with the cloven thumb, her golden blade held aloft, about to cut the life from her final offering. With a cry, Ray smashed the bar upon her hand with all the power she could muster. The priestess's wrist shattered and broke. The sacrificial blade fell into the water, and Ray gathered herself to strike again. She would fight with every atom of her being.
"So glad you could make it,"
said Mr. Thumb from somewhere below her.
"We've all been waiting for you."
He stood up, brushed the grass off his knees, and with a calming touch lowered Ray's arms from their attacking pose.
"Love the entrance, really. You're an inspiration. By the way,"
he gestured to the priestess, who was looking sullenly at the crumpled stump of her wrist,
"this is Oriana. She's your 12th great-grandmother, on your mother's side. She's going to marry us, aren't you, Oriana?"